Okay, hope everybody's doing well. Here we are for the last lecture in the free will and determinism chapter. So if you remember, we're worried about the problem of freedom and determinism that's generated by this apparent contradiction between the intuition that we have free will, at least some of the time, that some of our actions are the result of genuine and actual choices and deliberations that we make. Versus the standard account of causation that says everything that occurs, including human actions, are caused to occur by events or by causes that precede those actions or events. And so that's the basic problem that we're worrying about, how to reconcile, if at all, the intuition with free will with the standard account of causation. So far, we've looked at two attempts to do that. Hard determinism attempts to resolve the contradiction by saying we have to jettison free will. It's an illusion, so we go with standard causation. That's what all the evidence points to. So we got to abandon our notion of free will. They define free will a particular way, recall. The compatibilist says, hold on, even if determinism is true, it's still the case that we sometimes act on free will if the immediate cause of our action is an internal psychological or mental state. So both of those positions, and again, I say this all the time, but let me just remind everybody, there are many, many different arguments that might be given for these various positions and very subtly different arguments, right? And we're just looking at a few, usually just one per position, but there are many, many different ways to defend these views, right? And so when for our purposes in lecture here, when I talk about hard determinism, I'm talking about the particular version that we looked at, and soft determinism, the particular version we looked at, and so on and so on and so forth. And so what hard determinism and soft determinism or compatibilism both shared is the commitment to the standard account of causation. That's going to be different with libertarian free will. They're going to reject the universality of the principle of causation. So that's one thing that distinguishes libertarian free will from either of the positions that we've looked at so far. And again, here, what we're worried about is not a political or moral issue with regard to freedom, but the metaphysical problem of free will. Obviously, there's a relationship. If you don't have free will in the metaphysical sense, then it seems to undermine the idea that you can choose your actions and which ones are right or wrong. And likewise, that you can choose to engage in political activity in some way or another, right? So some notion of moral responsibility and political freedom, those sorts of things seem to presuppose some account of free will, right? Of the free will issue metaphysically. So, but we're not worried about, how much moral freedom or how much political freedom I have given laws that might restrict my behavior. We're worried about the metaphysical problem of whether we have any kind of free will at all. Right? So even if you were enslaved by a particular regime, a political regime, or a form of rule, right, in a particular society, if it's true that we had free will, it would just be that you weren't able to exercise free will in some way, even though you still had the capacity to do so, right? If you were enslaved, for example, you'd be subject to your master, but that's a political or an economic relation or a social relationship, not just a metaphysical one. And so when we talk about libertarianism here, I'm not talking about the view that limited government authority or a night watchman state, as some might put it. I'm talking about the metaphysical view that determinism is false. There's what distinguishes it from hard determinism and compatibilism, and that we're sometimes free and responsible for our actions. So a contemporary philosopher that argues for this position, in this chapter, this is the most contemporary thinker that's discussed in this chapter pretty much, is Robert Cain. And Cain rejects determinism on the basis of contemporary science. You might have picked up on this already, that de Holbach was reliant upon, he was an 18th century thinker, so he was reliant upon the science of his day, and the science of his day said the universe worked like a big mechanistic machine, basically, and we're just a cog in that machine, that it operated, the universe and us in it are subject to necessary and immutable laws, deterministic laws. Well, contemporary physics says that things are rather different than that. And Cain picks up on that. Here's what he says. He says, there is a tension and uncertainty in our minds about what to do at such times. He's talking about times when we experience ourselves deliberating and choosing an action. He says, let us suppose that is reflected in the appropriate regions of our brains by movement away from thermodynamic equilibrium, in short, a stirring up of chaos in the brain that makes us sensitive to micro indeterminacies at the neuronal level. What we experience internally as uncertainty about what to do on such occasions would correspond physically to the opening of a window of opportunity that temporarily screens off complete determination by past influences. So in other words, what he's doing is saying, look, the universe doesn't operate according to deterministic laws. What it does is operate according to probabilistic laws. And that seems to open up enough space in the physics for us to have an opportunity for free will, at least some of the time. And so the version of libertarian and free will that we're looking at draws a distinction between event causation and agent causation on the basis of that rejection of the universal principle of causation. They're not saying that that determinism never happens. It's just not universal, right? And so sometimes things happen just as determinism says, and that's what they're calling event causation here. So that's the idea that there are at least some, right, causal processes such that every event is the effect of antecedent conditions necessary and sufficient to bring about that effect, right? But not everything operates that way. Sometimes agents initiate their own causal chains of events, their own actions, without being determined by prior circumstances. And that's what he calls, that's what someone like Kane or a contemporary libertarian would call agent causation. Sometimes you just switch out libertarianism with agent causation theorist here, as your textbook mentions. So agent causation, again, is just the idea that some human actions are brought about by agents themselves. What we would need to do then is to defend the uniqueness of agents such in nature some way. That dovetails with another problem that we'll look at in the next chapter, the mind-body chapter. But for now, what we're worried about is just this distinction between event causation and agent causation, and the notion that, look, there's a hurricane out in the Gulf right now. When the wind blows hard enough, it's going to knock over some trees or some branches, depending on how much force those branches can take. That's event causation, cause and effect, right? But sometimes human beings initiate their own causal chains of events, right? So for example, me deciding to let go of a heavier than air object with my hand and letting it fall to the floor, where event causation takes over, but only because of what I'm doing with my hand with regard to that object, right? So got a magic mouse here. If I drop it, I'm not going to, but if I were to drop it, it would fall, right? But that's because of something that I did, right? So again, he's rejecting determinism here and then drawing a distinction between event causation and agent causation. And the idea, the evidence for agent causation is our intuition that we at least sometimes act freely. So if you remember way back, at least at the point in the semester when you're going to be watching this, it will be way back in the semester where you read about, from the article at the beginning of the semester by Johnson, where he talks about an appeal to intuition. This is the kind of intuition that's being, that idea of an appeal to intuition is the kind of idea that's going on in this argument here with regard to introspection and agent causation. It's because of the way we experience ourselves, and sometimes we experience ourselves genuinely deliberating, and in the absence of any kind of external constraints on our actions, we should think that we're acting freely in those circumstances. So again, we get non-Newtonian physics that tells us that the world does not operate according to strict deterministic laws, but rather probabilistic ones. So that's screening off complete determinism then. Our choices do depend, this is similar to the compatibilist, our choices do depend on our mental states, but they are not the simple results of prior events like they were assuming the truth of determinism for compatibilism. And then introspection, again, the ability that we have, the cognitive ability we have to look within our own thoughts and discern mental states, like whether I'm choosing one action over another, or whether I'm hungry or not, right? Or whether I'm angry or not, right? Whether I decided this morning to wear a blue t-shirt or another black t-shirt. That's based on introspection. We've seen that before with Rene Descartes, where he thought through introspection, he identified that, well, I at least know that I'm a thinking thing, right? I don't know anything else. So introspection is supposed to be providing for us some evidence with regard to our own mental states and choices. So drawing on those two notions, the denial of the universal principle of causation, again, denying its universality, and B, drawing on the idea that introspection provides evidence of agent causation, see if you can reconstruct or develop an argument for the libertarian conclusion that thus human beings are sometimes free and responsible for their actions. A key part, as I mentioned in the hints here, a key part of the major premise is going to have to rely on both A and B. It's going to have to include A and B in the premise. And again, for our purposes, you can do this fairly simply using a modus ponens or a modus tollens argument form. So pause here for a second and give a shot at reconstructing an argument for libertarianism. What I would do now is just hit pause for a minute and then get some practice reconstructing that argument and then start the video back up again. All right, so hopefully you took a minute and got your version of the argument down. Here's an argument here's a reconstruction that I did. And again, it's got to rely on those two notions of the denial of determinism and the universal principle of causation, and the idea that introspection gives us evidence of agent causation. So that's how I reconstructed my major premise here. If introspection provides evidence of agent causation, you could include here, in fact, why don't I redo it here to include that other key point. If introspection provides evidence of agent causation and determinism, and determinism is false, then sometimes human beings are free and responsible for their action. 2, introspection provides evidence of agent causation and determinism. Let me that up again. So then we got this basic argument here is a modus ponens, so it's valid. If introspection provides evidence of agent causation and determinism is false, then sometimes human beings are free and responsible for their actions. Introspection provides evidence of agent causation and determinism is false. There's the mode of affirmation. Thus, human beings are sometimes free and responsible for our actions. There's let's call that the agent causation and introspection argument for libertarianism. And then, of course, we're always worried about possible criticisms. And so for this, the one criticism of this that I'll mention, we might worry about whether the appealing to contemporary physics is enough evidence. Some of that's very controversial, so you might worry about an error of fact there, but we're going to worry about a philosophical objection here. Let's call it the introspection objection to libertarianism. And again, this comes from the idea that although surely some of the time we are transparent to ourselves and our introspective states are accurate, they don't always seem accurate. Sometimes you wonder, after all, whether you're really hungry or just bored, right? And so here's from Elliot Sober a quote that has this idea in it. He says, "There's no reason to place such complete trust in introspection. The beliefs we form by gazing within can be both incomplete and inaccurate. They can be incomplete because there may be facts about ourselves which we are not conscious. For example, the neurochemistry operating in my brain at any particular time. So that introspection fails to detect. In addition, introspection can be inaccurate because there are psychological mechanisms that systematically distort the way we appear to ourselves. The unconscious, for example. Although this view about introspection is characteristically Freudian, it's important to realize that many other approaches to psychology also endorse it." He's mentioning that because Freud has been largely debunked, right? But the idea that introspection is not reliable, Freud had that idea, but many other theories have that idea as well. So even though the reasons for it the Freudian reasons for it might not be accurate, the idea of introspection is still got weight to it. So he continues here, "There's a broad consensus that we should not take the testimony of introspection at face value. One time I watched this TED talk of a brain scientist who had had a brain aneurysm herself, and she was giving her perspective about that event, that aneurysm, that brain event that caused her some problems. Well, why is it that and she was reporting us what she felt at the time. Well, why should we take any of that accurate given that we know that your brain was having an aneurysm at that time, right? It's like if I knew that I was on LSD and I saw little green men running around, I probably wouldn't worry too much about the little green men running around if they're probably not really there, right? So why should we take introspection, just everyday introspection, is so reliable? It clearly goes wrong sometimes. So go back to our argument here. If suppose that sober is correct about introspection, it's unreliable, which premise or premises in this argument does that criticism attack? And is it saying that the argument contains an error of fact, fallacy, or self-contradiction? Again, you need to worry about what kind of evidence that was given. Was some kind of scientific evidence given for it? If so, then we got to worry about an error of fact. If the consequent doesn't necessarily follow from the antecedent in the conditional premise, but because of a lack of logical necessity rather than a contradiction, then we get a false conditional. Is it one of the informal fallacies that we've learned, or is it a self-contradiction? According to Sober's criticism, so in other words, what kind of criticism is the introspection, unreliability of introspection criticism? What kind of error is it claiming is in this argument? So there's something for you to worry about as you're thinking through this material. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up the all of our discussion of, well, our short discussion of free will and determinism here. The next chapter is on the philosophy of mind. So again, another chapter on a metaphysical issue. As always, if you have questions about anything we covered in lectures, be sure and post those to the discussion forum. Or if you want to email me the questions, that's fine as well. Or you can raise them in our Q&A session before the short answer assignment. And again, if you want to go ahead and do some of the short answer worksheets and practices and send those to me, so long as you give me enough lead time to get them, to look at them and return them to you before that Q&A starts, I can give you some feedback on your answers to help you out with the short answer assignments. All right, hope everybody's doing well. That'll do it for this lecture. See y'all next time.